Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University in the News. I'm Jeff Pearson. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen White. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing today?
Hey, pretty good, Jeff. Here for another exciting episode of In the News. I come to love these things because Jennifer always brings us awesome stories, awesome articles, and I took a look at the ones we've got here today. I think we got another great round. So, Jennifer, what have you have for us this week?
Well, hi, everyone. Today, the first news article is an in-depth article that I found in the Oregonian, and it is talks about how, despite Oregon's new housing law, some landlords are still turning away Section 8 tenants. For those listeners who may not know, the Section 8 program is a federally funded housing assistance program for low-income, elderly, or disabled renters. And this article follows one woman's attempts to get housing for herself and her children with a Section 8 voucher, but she keeps getting turned down. She keeps getting refused because of it. Then the article sort of expands and takes a larger look at the new Oregon law that went into effect on July 1st that prohibits Oregon landlords from discriminating against applicants with Section 8 vouchers. So technically, they are now a protected class in that state. The housing specialist groups have launched a big awareness campaign to try to educate landlords, but the article says they're still seeing problems. There's landlords who just aren't getting the message. It outlines, quotes somebody who is saying that they see way too many ads in the classifieds and things that say no housing assistance, no Section 8. And that is actually illegal now to put that in your advertisement for a rental property. So the state officials are going to continue to educate and enforce to ensure that these vulnerable groups do get the housing that they need. But it just kind of shows, first of all, kind of the stigma of Section 8 and also the attempts for states like Oregon to kind of help out these people and let this program be fully enforced. And it wouldn't surprise me if more states pass similar laws to this. Do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, especially in my area here in Western New York, it's split down the middle. I mean, I can understand both points of view too. You know, a lot of landlords look at the Section 8 as guaranteed rental payments. They're going to get that every single month, and usually, like you mentioned, it's a voucher that either covers the whole thing or a good majority of the rent, and that's a pretty reliable source of rental. From that perspective. The downside that I could see a lot of the landlords having problems with is, once you rent to somebody in that program, now you're open to the rules and regulations and the inspections and things that come along with it. So, for landlords that aren't prepared for that, that's going to be a problem.
I think one of the interesting things is that they say it doesn't force landlords to rent to someone just because they're on Section 8. It merely requires them to consider all rental applicants equally.
Right.
And we've talked about this before when we've talked about screening. Take a look at your best applicants, and if someone happens to be receiving assistance, that's okay. If they're the best candidate, then accept them as your tenant. And there might be a few other things that you open yourself up to, but at the same time, one, you have the guaranteed rent. You're going to get the rent. And two, if based on all of the criteria you've set down, they're the best candidate, why would you not rent to them?
Right. Yeah, I tend to agree with that too. And, in the article, they mentioned that the HUD inspection process is more streamlined. And I think if in any state, if they try, start to iron out a lot of the kinks in the bottlenecks in that system, it's going to be these states that start passing these type of laws. So hopefully that makes that inspection process better, or at least the paperwork process easier for landlords too. And if they're qualified and they're a good fit, then they should be considered. And for these landlords, I think the easiest thing to do is to just remove that language from their art or from their ads, and that would eliminate most of their problems. They don't, like you said, they're not legally bound to rent to them, but they have to consider them.
Right. And like when you're dealing with any protected class. You want to be sure that you've established your own guidelines and you work within those guidelines. The goal is not to say, well, I don't have that language in my ad, therefore I'm okay. The goal is to make sure that you are properly evaluating all of the applicants based on predetermined qualifications. And then when you get to the point that you're at the last one or two that you have to make that decision based on a gut feeling, then you can do that. But it really needs to be a situation where you establish those guidelines in advance. You know what you're going to accept or not accept. I think the benefits for communities in general with this type of a law is that it keeps the people who are receiving this type of assistance have in the past had to go to those low rent districts, those parts of town that people don't necessarily want to live in because they're not as good a part of town. This is giving people an opportunity to move away from those areas into places that are a little nicer to live in. It's not that they're going to the highest rent area in town, but it spreads this out so that we don't have these pockets of town that are all of the Section 8 housing. Is it going to solve a problem overnight? No, not at all. But it's going to give people a chance to not have to live in those parts of town where they don't feel comfortable walking around at night. And, again, with a tenant that brings a lot to the table and they just happen to be in a situation where they can't afford the rent, as often as not, you're going to find great tenants that bring this to the table. And okay, it's unfortunate that they don't have the funds to be able to pay for it themselves. We have a government program in place to provide that assistance. If they're the right tenant, don't hesitate to bring them in and allow them to be a tenant. You might find that they're the best tenant you ever had. And certainly there will be times that it doesn't quite work out, but you're going to get that with any tenant.
And I think a common misconception that I see a lot of times from the background check perspective is I've had a lot of people ask, they're Section 8 and they think that they can't do a background check on the person, which is not true at all. You still want to do the background check on that person. So just because they're receiving Section 8 doesn't mean that they haven't been evicted or they don't have a criminal history or, anything else that might not meet your screening standards. So you definitely still want to do the background check, even if they have a Section 8 voucher.
That's one of the stigmas with Section 8 is people think, oh, these are just poor people or criminals or whatever. But to actually qualify for the Section 8 program, it's a very rigorous process that these people are going through. The factors that the program looks at, they can't be convicted sex offenders, they can't be violent criminals, they can't have a drug history. They go through their own screening process to approve people. So if you're getting applicants that are Section 8 with Section 8 vouchers, it's kind of a bonus for a lot of landlords because they've already gone through a pretty rigorous screening process. And the other thing is they have a contact person at their various housing agencies that they have to check in with. If you're experiencing issues, you've got another resource that you can talk to and say, hey, this person, whatever, because they have to follow certain program standards as well. So a lot of landlords really like to have Section 8 because it's another level of security in a lot of ways as far as background screening.
And I don't know how it is in your guys' area, but in Western New York, there's a huge waiting list for people to get onto Section 8, so they don't want to lose it. So, they usually don't want to do anything that's going to get them off of that program. So that's a good incentive too, that they don't want to start from scratch. They want to, keep their benefits. So they're usually going to stay in line and they usually don't want to do anything to jeopardize that.
When I was a property manager, both of the multifamily properties that I managed were Section 8. We took a lot of Section 8 vouchers. So I'm a big fan. We rarely had any problems. They were very, like you said, very, very eager to make sure that everything was in place because it was such a valuable resource for them. And, the majority were just looking for a break, trying to better their situations. They weren't trying to scam anybody or anything like that. A lot of those negative stereotypes that maybe some people might have about Section 8 participants. So I would love to see this kind of law travel from state to state simply because of the massive education program that's associated with it. I really liked in the article these different housing agencies were saying, we're trying to educate everybody. We're trying to spread the word and put this program to its best use. So I think that's a real positive.
And, if a landlord has struggled with tenants, problem tenants, tenants that don't pay their rent. They've had to do evictions, and you're trying to figure out, what am I going to do to take care of this? And we've talked a lot about preparing your property so that it shows well, and marketing it well so that you get a good number of qualified applicants. But maybe you want to think about putting in big, bold letters, I accept Section 8. This is the best Section 8 housing you're going to find in town, and see what you get, because you can put that into your marketing and advertise that and see what type of response you get. And you might be surprised that you get some amazing prospective tenants, and then you run them through the background check. And when you get done, you've got one or two really solid candidates that you can look at. And you might find that the problems you've been having suddenly are significantly reduced. Well, that is interesting. It'll be fun to follow that one, Jennifer, and see what we see as far as maybe expanding to other states, and also kind of see how this one works up there in Oregon. So let's talk about our next article.
Sure. The next article, I actually found this on the Zillow website, one of my favorites. This is a new report that reveals that the number of Americans living with roommates or other adult family members is now more than 33%, which is up from 27% just about 8 years ago. The experts say that doubling up on housing is due to a weakened economy and also rising housing costs, whether that's renting or buying. All these costs have far outpaced the increase of income. We talked a little before in another in the news about how millennials, they're unable or unwilling to purchase homes, and they are helping to drive that growing rental market. But they're the prime candidates for doubling up on living arrangements. I thought this was really interesting because I know this is going to have a huge impact on landlords when it comes to tenant screening. So what do you guys think that landlords should do with this kind of information?
Well, it's always important to screen every applicant over the age of 18 in the household. So, I think that that's the one thing that's going to be important, is to make sure that they're just catching everybody that's eligible for screening in there. And yeah, we definitely see it a lot of times too, with the renters and the multiple roommate situations and everything else. So, I could definitely see this becoming more and more popular for sure.
I think, I was trying to remember, I seem to recall that young people are not getting married as early. So where in the past you would have a husband and wife applying for a rental, now you've got people that aren't getting married as early. So these young adults, in their 20s and early 30s, need to have somebody else to help pay the rent that otherwise a spouse might be helping to pay for. But I agree with what Steve said. If you're accepting applications for a property, you want to be sure that everyone who is going to live there is filling out an application. You do background checks on all of those people, and you take that into account when you're making the determination as to which is the best tenant for you.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is to always be careful when you're doing the background checks. There's a lot of services out there that'll offer sort of these joint applicants, and a lot of times they'll tell you that it's limited to just spouses. But even those, you want to be careful that they're not checking for joint records. And in a spouse situation, we see it a lot of times where the husband has everything in his name or the lease in his name, and so he's the one evicted versus the wife, who now knows enough to put everything in her name. So there is a lot of value in screening everybody that's living in the place, not just one person and assuming, well, we're going to base everyone else is going to be on that person's merits. It just doesn't work like that. They're smart enough to know that they're going to give you the best person, to screen for. So you want to screen for everybody, and you also want to make sure that your lease is in good order. You want to put in there that, if anybody defaults on the rent, who's going to be responsible and how that's going to be split. And for the landlords, just protecting themselves, just as they would in a co-signer or any other situation, to make sure everyone understands who has financial responsibility and what those responsibilities are in the event that somebody moves out or the relationship breaks off or whatever happens, that even when you're dealing with multiple people in the household.
That's a really good point. It's really important. And again, we talked in the previous article about the idea of making sure that you establish the criteria that you want to use for selecting your tenants. And it's going to be the same thing if you have 2 or 3 tenants who are applying to rent. And you want to be sure that you're looking at that each of those people individually and as a group as you compare them to the other applicants that you've received.
I think you guys are right on the money, but I also wanted to bring up the idea that if this sort of trend is increasing and that people are having a hard time finding places to live, to give landlords a big red flag about long-term uninvited guests. I know probably every landlord's had an experience where someone's girlfriend moves in and she's not on the lease, or somebody's brother is just going to be here for a few months or something like that. And if this trend is significant and still climbing, I think landlords should just really be aware of those sort of uninvited guests or long-term guest situations that could really mess things up.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely a common thing that comes up a lot that I hear is, at what point do you consider that person a tenant and no longer a guest? And different leases will word it differently, but it's usually a 2 or 3 week point there where and I've seen even shorter, but it usually says, if they're here for more than 2 weeks, they are now a tenant and they are subject to, the same rules of tenancy that the leaseholder is basically. So yeah, identifying that and making sure that that's in your lease and, you're going over that with them. And I think the more open that landlords are, the less likely you are to have people try and do it on the sly and try and hide it. And because I think that's what causes most problems is that lack of communication. And then you end up finding out the hard way that somebody's been living there for the past year. Ultimately you want your tenant to be able to come to you and say, hey, my brother lost his job and he's going to be living here. Is that okay? What do I need to do? And make sure everything is on the up and up and, above the table.
Yeah, the tough thing that happens there is there's a point legally at which somebody who's living in your property becomes their household. And in order to get them out, you have to go through the same legal process as if you had rented to them and they had signed all of the documents and the lease agreement and everything else. So it's a difficult situation. It's a really good one that Jennifer brought up, because even if you do an annual inspection, somebody can move in after your annual inspection and be there for a couple of months, and all of a sudden they are legally living there. And if you go to evict the tenant and you follow all of the legal processes to evict a tenant, you could end up with the tenant gone, but this other person who's essentially just squatting, having a right to be there. And you have to go through the same process to evict them. And you could extend the time that it takes you to get your property cleared so that you can rent it out again.
Yeah, definitely. And Jennifer, I'm sure you ran into this with managing rentals too, where you get somebody that, like I said, the boyfriend girlfriend situation where they break up and now one's not able to pay the rent and they end up vacating or just abandoning the property. And for a lot of times the landlords that don't make it clear up front, they don't have a real clear understanding of who to go after for the money and who's legally responsible for it. So is that something that you guys would run into?
Absolutely. That's, you never would look for that to happen. And when people sit down together and sign a lease, of course, they're never imagining the worst case scenario, but that's really important for landlords. You always have to imagine the worst case scenario. Hope it never comes, but if you have proper planning in place, then you'll be that much better off when that worst case scenario shows up.
Sure, definitely. That's something that I think perpetuates throughout so many different topics for landlords. Just plan for the worst. And that way, when it does happen, when it happens, not if it happens, when it happens, you could say, oh, yeah, I was totally prepared for this. I expected this to come, rather than, losing sleep and not able to eat for the day because, you're stressed about all these things that are happening. And I think just having the foresight to look ahead and say, yeah, what happens if these people don't stay together? What, is his income going to cover the entire rent? What's the situation here?
Now, one of the other positive or upsides to this article is that if you understand that this is what's happening, that there are a lot of people who are doubling up, which means that you have non-couple adults living in your unit, and you want to think about planning and preparing to be able to make your unit as appealing as possible. If you're doing some remodeling,
It's friendly too.
thank you,
Yeah.
exactly. If you're doing some remodeling, you might take that into account. Can you make it not necessarily that you have 2 master bathrooms, but maybe make a second bathroom a little bit more appealing to another adult who's living there. Again, if you're in the remodeling phase, it's definitely worth considering, because if you can advertise this as having 2 master bedroom combinations, master suites, then that could be very appealing to that type of a tenant. And again, when you start thinking about everything as a business, what can I do to make this most appealing so I can get the highest quality of tenant who stays here as long as possible? That might be something that you would want to consider. And even if you don't rent to that type of an applicant, if you end up renting to a family, the kids are going to love that type of a situation as well.
Parents are going to love that too.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Well, I think that's going to wrap up another episode of In the News. Jennifer, thanks again for bringing a couple of great articles, and we look forward to talking to both of you guys again next week.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University, and remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at thementorimpact.com.